Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the 8th Social Forum on Sustainability. The theme is the politics of hope, people's resilience and resistance in catastrophic times. Today, we have a lecture on the Kurdish freedom movement and hope in times of global capitalism by Havin GÜNEŞER. We provide English, Chinese, and Spanish simultaneous interpretation. You can choose the interpretation at the bottom of the computer screen. We would like to thank today's interpreters, Henrik Cottin, Anna Torres, Liang Yin, and Li Monghong. May I first introduce the co-moderator for today's sessions. My name is Xue Cui, Margaret Dradi. I am Associate Professor at the Institute of Rural Reconstruction of China at Southwest University in China. I am board member of Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives and one of the founding members of Global University for Sustainability. I have been actively involved in the rural reconstruction movement in China since 2000. John RESTAKIS has been active in the co-op movement for 25 years. He is the former executive director of Community Evolution Foundation and the BC Cooperative Association. John is also the co-founder of Synergia Cooperative Institute, a practitioner and pioneering researcher into international cooperative economies. He writes and lectures on economic democracy and the role of cooperatives in humanizing economies. In 2018, John visited Rojava and highlights the case of stateless democracy in Rojava in his forthcoming book, Civilizing the State, Reclaiming Politics for the Common Good. John is the author of Humanizing the Economy, Cooperatives in the Age of Capital, and now he lives in Vancouver, BC. I now pass the floor to John. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everybody. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be. Thank you, Margaret, for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here with your organization and your forums again. And I think it's going to be a fantastic opportunity here to learn about the extraordinary occurrences in Rojava and what is happening currently. So I would just like to begin by introducing our two other guests, beginning with our main speaker, Havin GÜNEŞER, who is an engineer, a journalist, and women's rights activist, who writes and speaks extensively about Abdullah Öcalan and the revolution in Rojava. She is one of the spokespersons for the international initiative Freedom for Abdullah Öcalan, Peace in Kurdistan, and the translator of several of Öcalan's books. She is on the advisory board of the journal Genealogy and is the author of Art of Freedom, Brief History of Kurdish Liberation Movement. And I would also like to introduce our discussant, Fouâd OVEISY, who is a PhD candidate in critical theory and comparative literature at the University of California, Irvine. He researches the intersections between realpolitik, political theory, and post-revolutionary strategy and literature, with a particular focus on the Kurdish question. He is the editor of the English section of RojavaStrategy.com. So with those few opening remarks, I would like to pass the word to our guest speaker and lecturer. The floor is yours, Havin. We look forward to your comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John, Fouâd, and Margaret. And thank you, Margaret, for, of course, organizing this and reaching out to me. It's a real pleasure to bring together, of course, different ideas from different parts of the world, so that we know what each others are doing, so we can be inspired by one another. And I'd like to say a special thanks to all those who are listening to us. And I hope that I do justice to the efforts and labor of the people who are right now struggling with their lives at the moment on the ground. Now, of course, when I picked this title, I didn't realize how challenging it was until I got to writing to it, because the title itself even evokes so many things at the same time. It evokes both hope and hopelessness in the face of what is happening to us, to our world in the 21st century, and all the while, of course, Kurdish freedom movement's connection to it needs expanding on, especially for those who have not yet heard of it. Let me just first come to grips with the hopelessness that I've just mentioned, which is not something we are unaware of, and actually does not really need that much of expanding on. Nearly 80 million people are forced to flee their homes. This is unprecedented. Despite global warming as a result of ecological destruction, the rate of destruction is not diminishing. Uninhibited extraction of resources that we can call pillaging continues all around the world, which is also one of the reasons why so many millions of people are forced out of their homes. At the same time, the extinction of species has occurred much quicker than any other time in history. It goes without saying that there is the huge and growing gap between the rich and the poor, a growing unemployment, migration, cultural degeneration, and immorality, monstrous monopolist forces, individuals reduced to nothing, and environmental destruction reminiscent of apocalypse in the last 4 centuries. But beyond these consequences, the over 5,000-year-old world civilization system exhausted all of the instruments of material and immaterial culture that it presented as remedies: the city, the economy, the state. And its ideological instruments, such as religionism, has lost its moral function, a sexism that spreads power into every pore of society, a nationalism that has drenched almost all of us in a chauvinism 1,000 times worse than any tribalism, and the scientism with no other purpose than to show capital and power monopolies the way to maximum profits. What remains of the arts is a cultural industry that commodifies any sense of beauty and the sublimity of feelings. This situation, referred to as the end of history, is the balance sheet of civilization. It is undeniable that particularly with the last 400 years, it is at the zenith of its intellectual and structural crises. Clearly, the problem of power and the state is in one of its worst phases. The dilemma of either a democratic revolution or fascism is on the agenda, and it is just so vital. The systems, regional and central UN organizations are no longer functional. Financial capital, which peaked during the most global phase of civilization, is the section of capital that most fuels the crises. The political and military component of the financial capital monopoly is an intensive war on society. This is what is being experienced on many fronts around the world. Determining what political and economic formations might arise from the world system's structural crises requires intellectual, political, and moral work, not prophecy and not just talk. During the financial capital era, society is at risk of disintegrating as never before in history. The political and moral fabric of society has been smashed, leading to a social phenomenon that even goes beyond genocide. Abdullah Öcalan calls this society-side. Virtual capital's domination of the media provides it with a weapon for executing a society-side worse than that of World War II, up against the canons of nationalism, religionism, sexism, scientism, and artisan with which the society is being battered 24 hours a day by the media, how can the society be defended? Hegemonic powers use media to effectively neutralize society's power to resist. With this weapon, they are building a virtual society. And virtual society is another form of society-side. You could also consider the nation state a form of society-side. In both cases, society is prevented from being itself, and it is transformed into a tool of the controlling monopoly. Just as it is very dangerous to treat social nature simplistically, preventing it from being itself exposes it to unclear dangers. The age of the virtual monopoly, like the financial capital age, is only possible in a society that has ceased to be itself. Thus, it is no coincidence that both appeared during the same period. The society that the nation state has deprived from being itself, and the society because it thinks it is the nation state itself, and the one that the media has seduced, is a totally defeated society. From the rubble of societies like this, the hegemonic powers are building something new. There can be no doubt that this is the social age in which we find ourselves. We are not only living in the most problematic societies to date, but in societies that offer nothing to the individual. Our societies have not only lost their moral and political fabric, their very existence is under threat. Our societies are not just experiencing some random problem. They face the threat of destruction. If the problems of our age continue to grow and become more profound and cancerous, despite the effectiveness of science, society side is not just a hypothesis. It is a real danger. The claim that the rule of the nation state protects society creates a huge illusion and only makes this danger gradually come true. Wars for hegemony have become more multifaceted, intense, and long-lasting compared to previous periods in civilization. Both national and international monopolies participated in these wars. Whereas there have always been local and regional wars, we're now seeing warfare with a genuinely global reach for the first time. Even more serious, however, is that society itself has been increasingly militarized by the nation state and fully submerged in a kind of war. It makes sense to call present-day society a state of war society. It's been imposed in two ways. First, power and the state apparatus control, oppress, and surveil any society they have wrapped themselves around. Second, the information technology, rather media monopolies, that have developed as a result of the qualitative revolution of the past 50 years has replaced real society with a virtual society. Both states of war can be called also society side. These new society sides, in addition to the now more limited practice of genocides, which the Kurds are facing yet again at the moment, prepare the end of social nature by being more intense and continuous. Perhaps creatures resembling human beings will continue to exist, but they will do so as a fascist mob or a herd-like mass. The consequence of society side is much more severe than that of genocide, manifesting itself in the loss of society's moral and political nature. That human masses feel no responsibility to act even in the face of the severest of social and ecological disasters attest to this. It is beyond question that we are in a situation that is more than another depression or crisis. So when Öcalan is saying all of this, he's not working up to the point where he's about to declare that this situation of crises will definitely lead to a revolution. Crises, we've seen, not only give impetus to revolutions, but they also generate counter-revolutions. The universalist, progressivist school of thought endeavored to drive successive forms of society that develop from worse to better, from crisis theories, but concrete reality has not confirmed these theories actually. So we are faced with the question of how to live, what to do, and where to start from. But let me bring up now, up to speed, the other part of my talk. That is the Kurdish freedom movement and its connection to hope in times of capitalism. And the Kurdish freedom movement is, of course, a part of a string of movements that form this hope in times of capitalism. Now, of course, as much as I would like to, I cannot give the historical background of either the Kurdish question that led to the founding of the PKK, nor the history of the PKK in full. Even as I'm speaking, I can see that already 18 minutes are up, so I'm not sure how we're going to manage all this. But what I can do here is give a very short overview over certain points in history that are important for the understanding of the development of the movement and why it gives hope to the people. In modern times, Kurdistan was always divided between several states. From the 17th century on, the Ottoman Empire and the several Persian dynasties ruled over it. After World War I, it was divided among the modern states of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. The suppression of Kurdish cultural identity was the worst in Turkey, where the use of the language and even the words Kurds and Kurdistan were banned from use. Inspired by the revolutionary youth movement from 1968 and anti-colonial struggles in many parts of the world, especially in Vietnam, the PKK was founded as part of the revolutionary socialist movement in Turkey, with the stated aim of uniting Kurdistan in a democratic and socialist fashion as part of a Middle East federation. This was written in its manifesto of the PKK. Founded in 1978 and heavily affected by the extremely violent military coup in Turkey in 1980, the PKK regrouped in Lebanon and waged an armed struggle against the military regime in 1984. In just a few years, the movement became very popular and grew from a small group of professional revolutionaries into a popular movement that sparked the growth of new political parties, NGOs, civil society, a rich cultural scene, and women's organizations that attracted hundreds of thousands of people in all parts of Kurdistan. While in the beginning, the question of women's freedom had not played a very prominent role, this changed in the 1990s, when Öcalan and the PKK declared the liberation of women to be just as, or even more important than the liberation of the homeland. Or rather, Kurdistan could never be free unless the women were free. The Kurds experienced numerous massacres in all four parts. After a while, the state, especially in Turkey, in North Kurdistan, did not even need soldiers with guns, because just a guard would be enough for a submissive and self-censoring life to prevail. Again, this is why the slow but very steady development of this freedom movement brought back trust, brought back the confidence of the Kurdish people in themselves, and gave them back their dignity. I would say imagination was a key element in the formation of this freedom movement. Under such circumstances, they were brave enough to imagine that things could be different, very different, but also acted upon it. In the early 70s, the first group came together around Öcalan. Gradually, in 78, this group became a party and had its founding congress in a small village in a very poor house with 22 people, 2 of whom were women present. From 1978 to 1984, over a 6-year period, the condition of an armed struggle were established. On August 15, 84, the armed struggle began. This date marks the start of the armed resistance against not only colonialism, but imperialism and occupation in Kurdistan. This sudden action taken at 2 military posts in North Kurdistan was a sort of rejuvenation, because at the time, the Kurdish people were presumed dead, totally incapable of reviving themselves, especially in North Kurdistan. Thus, it is known among the Kurds in the north as the Day of Revival. This date is significant because it is a turning point, because it seemed so unlikely, so impossible. Or if it happened, it would not last. The state would crush it in a week or a month. Even to date, the Turkish state says tomorrow we'll finish up the PKK, actually. The Kurdish people, as well as the guerrilla, saw that the coercive power of the state, as a result of this action, was not omnipotent. It would and could collapse. So by the 1980s, to most Kurds, PKK had become a symbolic figure for Kurdish resistance against oppression of dictatorships and military regimes, against denial, annihilation, and genocide. The success of PKK-led resistance restored confidence and dignity to the people. By the 1990s, the Kurdish people's movement was focused not only on Kurdish identity, but on gender equality and women's freedom. This in itself was a revolution on its own, considering the position of women not only among Kurds, but also in Turkey or within the Middle East in general. All these developments came at a cost. The 1990s saw the killing of more than 30,000 people, most of them Kurds. Thousands became victims of state-controlled death squads. More than 4,000 Kurdish villages were destroyed by the state. Kurds in their millions became refugees internally and internationally. In response to the increase in pressure on Syria by the US and Turkey, Öcalan decided to leave Syria, where he was ever since 1993. And he had to leave on October 9, 1998. He said at the time that despite his attempts, the Syrian state would not adopt a strategic friendship and a strategic approach to the Kurdish issue. He went to Europe instead of going to the Kurdish mountains, in the hope that there might be a way to achieve a democratic, political, and peaceful solution to the Kurdish question. In 1998, when Öcalan went to Europe, the international community of nation states passed him around from one state to another, first to Greece, followed by a back and forth to Russia, returning to Greece, then going on to Italy, then back to Russia, and finally back to Greece. The Greek state and its government at the time said they would take him to South Africa, but instead they took him to Kenya. By they, I mean a NATO operation that included the CIA, the Mossad, and their leading other players like MI5 and 10 and others, I guess. He was told that he was on a plane to South Africa, but he was in fact brought to Kenya, where he was abducted later and handed over to the Turkish officials at the Nairobi airport. Of course, there was a huge outcry from Kurds across the world. In fact, with this Kurdish outcry, Öcalan, who until then had been a leader of the PKK and one of the founders of it, he became a leader for the Kurdish people and their struggle for dignified self-determination across the world, a symbol of their freedom. In Öcalan, Kurds saw what might befall them once again. On the one hand, they had a very tested relationship with him because of all the difficult periods and stages that Öcalan had steered them through all those years. On the other hand, there was the historical experience that after a rebellion is crushed, a genocide follows. Therefore, Kurds everywhere, in the 4 parts of Kurdistan, in the US, in Australia, in Europe, everywhere, basically did not go home. Even Madeleine Albright had to make a statement at the time. She said something to the effect, we didn't expect such a reaction from the Kurds. In his submission to the Court of Athens, Öcalan said, I had to strip myself of all personal feelings of dignity. I had to think very hard about what to do next. Because he was, of course, also very much aware of the historical consequences. And he said that the nation states bet on the fact that no one in the world, by which I mean not the UN, none of the NGOs, or any of the nation state would chase up to what happened to him. Who would chase up what is happening to the Kurds? We even experienced it recently. Who would care? Therefore, he says, I was compelled to think it through and act responsibly. As a result, there were a lot of people who took to the streets in process, and around 70 people self-immolated. It was for him, but at the same time, it was actually for themselves, as they knew what would be next in store. Öcalan, however, when he had the chance, called on everyone to stop. At the show trial on the island of İmralı, where he has now been held since 1999, instead of going or doing what was expected of him, he did something else. He came up with new ideas. These new ideas were presented in an atmosphere and ambience of state-orchestrated lynching. His lawyers were lynched. His family members were lynched. He tried to turn people away from violence back to ideas, not only the protesting Kurd, but also the Turkish national. Everybody was shocked because everybody was expecting something else from him. Some people expected him to go on a hunger strike or even kill himself in prison. Others were expecting him to surrender to the state. Afterwards, as his approach was increasingly understood, trust in him grew even more, and his strategic thinking and foresight was understood. And of course, also his ability to come up with new ideas. So from 1999 to 2005, there was another period of reorientation for the PKK. It marked a complete break with the whole of classical civilization and patriarchy. From 1993 to 98, there had been attempts and efforts to rebuild the organization. This was, among other things, a reaction to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in the 1980s, after feminism reaching its apex, and it affected everybody, including the PKK, but it was unable to influence society at large and it dwindled, the PKK took lessons from that as well. So during the lifetime of the PKK, all of the real socialist experiences, including that of China, and other alternative movements came to a standstill. This is another layer that I want to emphasize. So instead of neither Öcalan nor the freedom movement giving up the idea, the movement began to really pose the question, why? What was being done wrong? So they began to critique a lot more real socialism, as well as they gave huge self-critiques in order to be able to overcome it. So learning from all these different movements around the world was a very, very important part of all this. So Öcalan responded extensively to these questions. He didn't just go ahead and say, okay, you know, like everything for the existence of the Kurds as a nation. He didn't do that. What he did do, that he put out more than 60 books, 13 of them written on the island of İmralı as court submissions. So don't anyone think that the Turkish jailers are very kind to him. They are submissions to various courts. So in the midst of everything that was happening in the world politically, Öcalan produced an analysis, especially in the 90s, which he called "To insist on socialism is to insist on being human." So when patriarchal traits in the movement were becoming more prominent, and also within the Kurdish society, or rather, because of the struggle, they were exposed to an even greater degree. In 1996, he developed an analysis that later became a book titled "Killing the Dominant Male." All this to say that there were many attempts at this time, you know, before 99, but the clear rupture after a series of developments, of course, came after 1999. And from 99 to 2005, he broke with the idea of state completely. His books show his arguments and the thinking that went into making that rupture. So I urge all of you to go and read it. It's on öcalanbooks.com. I think after this, the pieces began to fall into place. This is why he came up with what he calls democratic civilization, and how he went back and evaluated history to this end. Let me take a bold jump to 2011, to the Rojava Revolution, which is based on these ideals, actually. So the revolution in Rojava cannot be separated from the ideological and political developments of the past 45 years. It didn't come out of thin air. On the contrary, it was based on all the labor and organizational efforts of not only the previous 45 years, but even before that, including those of the people in Rojava throughout all this time. I think now is the time to look at the Kurdish freedom movement's history from the perspective of the idea and practice of critique and self-critique. I think this is very important because we really need to understand a little bit about the dialectics of the PKK's constant evolution and self-renewal. As some think that all these changes occurred because Öcalan was abducted or it just happened overnight. It was a constant renewal and resilience. We talked about the changes in the world over the 45 years or 50 years and their influence on this movement. But the movement's own struggle also surfaced and gave rise to new knowledge and made manifest new aspects of the truth of the Kurdish people and that of humans. We are made to think of world history in a very linear way. For example, we only look at the struggle of the working class under capitalism most of the time. So we don't see the struggle of, let's say, the colonized people or tribes and clans that resisted being sucked into patriarchal and class civilization. These are just as important as the struggle of the working class. And of course, another example is the struggle of the women and their resistance to assimilation into this civilization. The fact is that all these different struggles have exposed aspects of this larger truth. And what Öcalan is actually trying to do with his theory of democratic civilization and democratic modernity is to bring all of these together as the integral truth, as the whole truth. To this end, along with the development of theory, many women's organizations were formed, and the consciousness about patriarchy and women's freedom grew in the 1990s. However, all these attempts did not really overcome the limits and framework of patriarchy, which the PKK also had. So not only the women's movements in the movement, but the whole organization was searching for an alternative. Although the PKK was not the old left, it was nonetheless unable to come up with a solution that completely broke away from real socialism, and with it, capitalist modernity. One can define the period from 93 to 2003 as the transition period, accompanied by the attempt to establish an alternative to capitalist modernity. And Öcalan sees that not breaking away with the idea of the nation state or the state itself in general, behind the decay of communism or socialism in the Soviet Union, in China, in Cuba, or in other places. Now, the available theoretical material, the past experiences, feminism, and the very experience of the PKK led Öcalan and the movement to conclude that women's enslavement constituted the very basis of all subsequent enslavements, as well as all other social problems. Thus, it began to distinguish itself from classic Marxism and Leninism. It also differed in the way it began to view the state apparatus. The movement and Öcalan sees the state as an instrument of power and exploitation that is unnecessary for the continuation of human and natural life. On the contrary, as a detriment. Finally, its perception of revolutionary violence also changed, and they began to frame it as self-defense. Now, Öcalan determined that women's slavery had been perpetuated on 3 levels over the 5,000 years of civilization. First, there was the construction of ideological slavery. We all know how it goes, we are from the ribs of Adam or this or that, but we are definitely the weaker sex. And then the use of force, and finally, the economy was seized from her. He was quick to make the connection between the depth of women's enslavement and the intentional masking of this fact, and the rise of hierarchical and statist power within society. As women were habituated to slavery, the path to the enslavement of other sections of society was paved. The enslavement of men followed. However, women's enslavement is different in some ways to class and nation enslavement. It is legitimized by refined and intense repression combined with lies that play on emotions. Women's biological difference from men is used to justify her enslavement. All the work she does is taken for granted and treated as the unworthy work of women. Now, without analyzing this process by which women were socially overcome, you can neither understand the fundamental characteristics of the existent male-dominated social culture, or, more importantly, what we should build in its place. If we do not understand how masculinity was socially formed, then we cannot analyze the institution of state and therefore accurately define the culture of war and power that is behind states and statehood. Now, this is something that Öcalan emphasizes a lot, because this is what paves the way for femicide and the colonization and exploitation of peoples. Öcalan points out that war by the state and the hand and the strong and the violent hand of men within the family are symbols of hegemony. And the entire class society, from the upper to the lower end, is caught between these two and always assimilating it back into the system. Now, Öcalan, of course, interprets not only written facts, but also mythologies to understand what happened in our distant past, in order to understand where the truth lies when it comes to the loss of freedom, not only of women's freedom, but of men and society. The third very important thing was the seizure of the economy. In ancient Greek, John would know better than me, maybe, oikonomia is, of course, householding or management of the home, very much belittled nowadays as if householding is petty. The seizure of the economy, that of women and of peoples, is also an important factor in the creation of this slavery. In fact, if you look at it, this conclusion makes it clear that all colonization, exploitation, and class formation fits this template. If you look at colonized peoples, you will see something very similar, or even the working class. I see how the Kurds were colonized and lost their freedom. It was done exactly in this way. They gave us an ideological narrative how we don't exist, and even if we do, we're not worth it. And they used a lot of force and violence to make that accepted. But also, they took all the resources away from the decision-making power of the locals, of the Kurds, of the people of the region. Now, of course, when we look at women again, we see that by the time women came to who we are, they were burned, they were buried alive for centuries. They were beaten so badly that all their bones were literally broken, not symbolically. In some of the ancient tradition to date, women's feet are still bound in very tight footwear or in iron shoes so that they can't walk very fast. And we are told this is a symbol of beauty, when it is in fact a symbol of domination. Now, not only the economy of women was seized, the economy was also seized from women, as I said, but it was seized from the workers, the colonized people, and the oppressors. Now, Öcalan says that capitalism and the nation state represent the dominant male in its most institutionalized form. Capitalist society is the continuation and culmination of all the previous exploitative societies. So it is, in fact, a continuous war against society and against women. And if we just look around the world, actually, we can see how true that is still. That it is the monopoly of the tyrannical and exploitative male because of the violence and exploitation against women and especially against the indigenous peoples. And this is not only happening, in the so-called third world countries, especially in relation to women, but all over the world, especially in the capitalist world as well. Now, of course, I would really like to go into it more and more, but I am seeing that we are already, 15 minutes to 5, I guess. That's been about 45 minutes. So what I want to do is I really want to skip all of this and skip the conclusions. I mean, there was a lot of things I really wanted to say and which would have made a lot of sense about the state, the situation of the society, women, and most of all, the situation of the male because at the moment, the worst and the most regressive sections of capitalism is trying to turn the dominant male into its paramilitary force all around the world, to push the society's demand for freedom. So, but I'm not going to go into that. It's in the speech somewhere that I had prepared, and it has taken far too long already. So let me go into the conclusions for the Kurdish freedom movement, and also talk a little bit more about the ideas that is, above all, is trying to be practiced in Rojava, but not only, in Bakur, in the south, and that's why there's huge crises in South Kurdistan as well, and slowly and gradually in Roshilat as well, which is still not so much possible at the moment for the Kurdish freedom movement. Now, all these insights have led to a number of conclusions. So they are not interpreting people's right to self-determination as the acquisition or having a nation state. They are not acting themselves in a state and power-centered way, but they wage a struggle that is centered around democracy, women's freedom, and an ecological society, and strives to construct an alternative life based on this. They try to develop an ideology based on moral and political society. And this is a huge term, I realize, which I'm just throwing on, but please read on Öcalan, he extensively talks about it. And this society is grounded in solidarity. Now they are trying to interpret history through this lens and write a true history of women, and thereby history of humanity. They are trying to develop the ability to differentiate between self-defense and violence or force. Doesn't matter whether it is revolutionary or not. So it's not about revolutionary violence, it's about self-defense. They are not basing the economy on accumulation of surplus values and products, but on society's collective needs-based decisions. And they want to make knowledge available to everywhere, to everyone, in order to prevent the creation of monopoly over knowledge. Because this is something that we face in the capitalist world and in patriarchy. Now, to this end, all the sections of society that have been traditionally exploited and suppressed are asked to organize themselves in autonomous organizations. This applies above all to women because she's the basis of all enslavements, and the youth, but it also includes different peoples, communities, groups that have been excluded from all decision-making structures and exploited and oppressed. And later, what happens is that all these different organizations of those exploited, excluded, oppressed come together in decision-making structures and participate in overlapping structures. So for example, as a woman, I would be in a women's organization, but I would also be, let's say, as the co-mayor or mayoress of a town, also in another organization, or if I'm a doctor in another organization, or if I'm a farmer in another organization, etc., etc. facilitating the creation of an internal dynamic for fighting against the re-establishment of patriarchy. Because we are all, as individuals, have been shaped under this, men and women alike. So we tend to go back to our, our ingrained selves. So in order to make sure that even after the revolution, like in Rojava, that the reestablishment of patriarchy doesn't go on, you need to keep that dynamic going so that there is a constant synergy, energy between the oppressors. Okay, the Kurdish male is also oppressed, but up against the women and the youth and the children and whatever, they can be oppressors. So you need this dynamic constantly, and not only as individuals, but as an organized force, so that, the re-establishment of patriarchy is prevented. And its institutions are prevented at every moment of every day. Because patriarchy and its ways have a way of occupying and, so, and as I said, what's also very important is that those who are traditionally oppressed should not be acting as individuals, but within an organization. Because then, as an individual, I might be afraid of a certain act, positioning, posture of a person, but I have a huge movement behind me or an organization that can push the demands forward. So this will give a leverage that is needed in whatever structure that they find themselves. I guess it's only the men who are not organized per se. They are the only ones who are not organized on the basis of being males, because they are already organized within the patriarchy, both to their detriment and to the detriment of women, the youth, and the society. So self-defense, I mentioned a little bit, is central in this regard, because, and I mean in terms of women and the men, because inequality has not just been, constructed between states and peoples, but it's also replicated between men and women. This is why Kurdish women that are sympathetic to the Kurdish freedom movement's ideas are organized as a separate self-defense organization of women. They are autonomous. Because we saw when the going gets tough, the men may and can leave you. And on top of it, for internal, to destroy the internal inequality, and that it's not replicated, this is also needed. And of course, the self-defense should not just be seen as a physical self-defense. This is why women is organized in every sphere of social life, autonomously, from health to education to law to whatever you can think of, so that they can gain back all that they have lost to patriarchy. Now, of course, all of this has a revolutionizing effect on society. Our energies that were suppressed are now being broken, shattered, so that the energy can flow. And of course, the idea here is to overcome the idea of vanguards and to make sure that, of course, there are still guides that you can call professional revolutionaries, but the actual idea is to make sure that this frozen energy of the people can be reinvigorated in these different mechanisms that overlap, and they themselves can give shape to their society. Not if I say, oh, do it like this or do it like that, or if Öcalan says it, or if somebody else says it. So this is so crucial in what is going on in Rojava. Now, of course, everybody can see this revolutionizing effect on society. We even saw it at some point around the world. The whole world was actually influenced greatly what was happening in Rojava, And then, especially in Turkey, and with Turkish state's vicious attacks, physical attacks, both in North Kurdistan, inside Turkey, in Syria, in Rojava, in Iraq, in South Kurdistan, to stop by using this extraordinary violence. They wanted to stop women and the youth from seizing this opportunity and to come out of the crises of, capitalist modernity with something else and expand the freedom area for everybody. So all this violence was for nothing. And there were other games, of course, in the West, and there were fascism in other countries that came to power. So this is also a very important point. I'm jumping again. Maybe I should actually finish here. I realized I didn't talk about democratic modernity so much yet, but I think I was able to give the gist, the essence, the soul of what is happening or what they are trying to do. And of course, there are 13 books. I think we have translated about 11 of them. And Öcalan goes into all of this in a lot of depth. The last book we translated was The Sociology of Freedom. And there he actually goes into what democratic civilization is, how he frames it, how he frames democratic modernity as the counterpart of capitalist modernity, and of course, democratic civilization as the dialectical counterpart of the patriarchal civilization. And he says he's not creating something out of the thin air. It's there. Only we are used to looking at history, from the rise and fall of empires and states, and imperialism did that and this. But what did the people do? And their achievements, and what is the fight about over these 5,000 years? I think he gives this marvelously. I'm now working on a big red book, I call it. It's like huge. I don't know how many pages it is yet. I think 500 odd pages. We called it Beyond State, Power and Violence. It will be out soon. And I think it is one of the most extensive, history of humanity. Maybe we should have named it as such. But I'm going to leave it here. I hope, and I know that both John has been to Rojava and he's written on it, and also Fouâd the same. So I hope that whatever I left off in regard to that can be complemented and supplemented by them. So thank you very much, and I'm very sorry if it was very long.
Thank you, Havin. I was just saying that you've covered so much territory. I hardly know where to begin. There are so many powerful points that you've touched on in reviewing the evolution of Öcalan's thought and his work. Perhaps I'll just say that just two or three things really stood out for me, which I thought were very resonant with the example of Rojava and its importance. I think the first thing that struck me in what you were saying is that perhaps the democratic confederalism that is being explored in Rojava, it represents what I would call a maturation of democratic theory and praxis, that it offers a new template for modernity, what you call democratic modernity. But for me, what I read in the story you tell is an evolution and a continuation and a deepening of certain fundamental democratic ideals and principles, which until now have in a sense been fossilized or captured within the structure of the nation state and of representative democracy. And what you're describing, of course, is a further evolution and a further deepening of these democratic principles as liberation from exploitation and oppression. And that stateless democracy, in my view, is really a further evolution of what it means to actually think about and organize a democratic society. That is to say, a civil society. So that's one point I think that strikes me. The second point that strikes me is how important it is to place Rojava and the revolution in Rojava in the context of what is really a global movement for the rise of civil power as a reaction to state power and economic power. And so the rise of, especially last year and really over the last, especially gaining momentum over the last 15 years or so, is a global rise of movements to promote civil power and a further deepening of democracy and democratic practice outside the confines of the nation state. And Rojava, I think, is like a beacon within that movement and represents what may be possible. There are a couple of questions that I would like us to discuss at some point. One is, to what extent is the current self-administration in Northeast Syria in its administration of governance and of the democratic institutions that are being established in Rojava, to what extent is the administration of these governance structures different, materially different and fundamentally different from the administration of a conventional government, of a conventional representative government? So this is something that I would very much like to hear your reflections on. The second question I would very much like to get some discussion on is to what extent the promotion of gender equality, both within the philosophy and within the practice of democratic confederalism in Rojava, to what extent this has actually been institutionalized and realized in the everyday working relationships of the institutions of the self-administration, of the councils, of the communes, and so on. I know how important it's been in the formation of the women's self-defense units, the PYJ, in military and self-defense terms, but I'm very interested in hearing your reflections on to what extent it's actually taken hold within the society itself. And the last point I would just like to raise is your comment around democracy, and in this case, deep democracy, as a self-defense mechanism on the part of society to institutions of oppression and exploitation and colonization. I think this is a very central point when we think about transformation and political and civil society evolution, and to what extent deep democracy in the way it is being expressed in Rojava is in fact a form of social self-defense against these institutions of power and exploitation in society, most completely expressed within capitalist society and the nation state, as you point out. So those are just some of my thoughts as I was, taking notes and thinking about what you were describing in the work of Öcalan and his movement in Rojava. But I'll just now invite Fouâd perhaps to share some of his own reflections and comments on the talk he just gave, or even on the points that I just raised. Fouâd, could you take the floor?
Thank you very much, Havin, for the great talk, and John as well for the questions. I just want to add a question, a consideration based on some of the points that John brought up, and also mainly based on two of the main discussion topics within Havin's talk, and that was on the concept of self-defense and counter-revolution. And given the fact that the administration in Rojava has been under so much basically counter-revolutionary pressure from all sides, from the Syrian government, from obviously Islamic State, Turkey most importantly, and amongst other actors, I would appreciate if you could further comment on the relationship between how a certain form of, shall we say, preservation of the democratic institutions within the frameworks of democratic nation and democratic modernity could be kind of coordinated with withstanding these counter-revolutionary waves and pressures that are coming in. Because, say, what we have seen over the recent years is a certain transformation of the agenda of, say, of the YPJ, of the women's protections units, from shall we say, more of a protections units into more of an anti-terror, anti-ISIS units, and to a certain extent also sidelining of their original demands and mandates within that kind of transitional framework, which can be to some a bit disconcerting, given the fact that obviously the demands of self-defense are very important and cannot be denied, and at the same time the agenda that comes with that seems to put pressure on some of the democratic aspirations. So maybe elaborate more on the relationship between self-defense and counter-revolution, and specifically as to what Abdullah Öcalan himself would comment on such a linkage. Thank you.
So Havin, would you like to respond to some of those points?
Yeah, well, they're all a huge areas of discussion on their own. I mean, if you realize, I haven't really at all gone into the recent developments and the power plays in the region at all, because what I wanted to give, because usually this is the areas of close focus, everybody is just talking mainly of what is happening on the surface, rather than what are the actual ideas that derive the experience in Rojava, and not only in Rojava, of course. I guess Rojava is easier to talk about because the Syrian Assad regime was declared a terrorist regime all over the world, basically, and therefore it did not constitute, especially later on, to talk about the Kurds in Rojava. And nobody really, apart from Turkey, talked about them as terrorists. At the beginning, everybody tried to ignore what was happening in Rojava because the US couldn't use them against Syrian Assad regime and all that. So people weren't sure, including superpowers, who the hell these people were. So, but I'll try to be as brief as I can on the points that you have raised. Now, John, you said, to what extent is this current self-administration different from, or how it differs from the conventional government? Now, of course, I think you need to have a look at this in the vein that I've been talking about, in the vein that there are huge overlapping structures, for any given one sphere, whether also whether it's war, because the war in Rojava not only concerns, even in fact, just Rojava, but all the Kurds, because there is an attempt, because we talked about the structural crises and that there is no such status quo yet. And, especially the US is driving behind the destruction of the status quo. It may seem paradoxical, but this is the truth. And it's in fact the US behind Turkey, going and invading lots of different lands in the Middle East, all the way to Africa, and it's expanding its area of influence. I am not saying it's under the stamp every little, step they take, but they, of course, try to make benefit from this destruction of the status quo, because Turkey would have liked to kept it like Iran as it was, because these are the two main regional powers that can try and keep it as it is, but in the case that they couldn't keep it as it is, now Turkey is trying to see if it can create its Turan. China would know a little bit about this too, because of the Turkic communities. It's another reason why Turkey wants to stay in Afghanistan, so they're because of the Uzbek communities there. So they have this notion that is beyond actually the neo-Ottoman dreams of the present Turkish administration. Is this possible? To me, it's not, because they have nothing going. I mean, it's just booting, pillaging. They take nothing to even their own, if they call it their own peoples. So, but the self-administration in this sense is neither exactly the democratic autonomy and democratic confederalism that we're talking about, theoretically, nor the conventional state or government. Now, because I mentioned something very, very important, it would be a dream to think that, yes, it all happened and it's all there. It's not true. It's not true, one, because people's expectations still have not totally changed, because we talked about the society side and how to invigorate the society. And this is why there are all these mechanisms to try to juggle up, hope, expectation, what you think of a state, what should the state do? Because, despite, of course, over, I think it's been now 20 odd years that we are discussing how state is a detriment, not only to women, but to society and the nature and everything else. There are still, of course, those who feel that the only way to stop the genocide of the Kurds is to have a state, and this is pumped a lot. I think I'm going to answer questions within one another. This is pumped a lot into the Kurdish community by some of the backward Kurdish forces within the Kurdish society. For example, the KDP, which is the main military and monopoly in South Kurdistan, in Iraq, they hold the monopoly over the oil fields, they hold the monopoly of force, and they are partners of both the US and the Erdogan AKP government. So what they are saying in all parts of Kurdistan is that, the PKK or Rojava is not really for the benefit of the Kurds, So they are trying to incite this dominant male, as I talked about, as it is in the whole world, like Trump's man in the, you know, in Washington as they stormed the building, in the Kurdish society too. What they are trying to do is give some share of pillage to this male, so that they act like a paramilitary force within the society. This is happening in Turkey in general. As you're probably following, there's the huge femicide, an attack on women and children in the society, aside from the Kurds, you know. And, but also, like in Rojava, for example, Turkey invaded Afrin, among other places. Now in Afrin, they tell the international community of states that there is a Kurdish council there, when in fact there is no such thing, and Afrin is being depopulated from Kurds. There's an ethnic cleansing, but this group of men mostly are actually from a part of politics that are aligned with the KDP, the Barzani clan. So therefore, what Turkey is trying to do is trying to, via some Kurds, you know, like this, patriarchal and also collaborators, trying to both pull back the demands for freedom of the Kurdish society, but also to legitimize the occupation and the attacks of the Turkish state regime, not only in Rojava, but everywhere else. You know, at the moment, Turkey has over 70 military bases in South Kurdistan in Iraq, over 70. And at the moment, the US is actually pulling into South Kurdistan to build their own bases there. So therefore, what they are trying to do is create a base in Kurdistan to attack from into the Middle East and beyond. They are trying to push the Kurds against Iran. They are trying to push the Kurds to give their wars. So therefore, the Kurdish freedom movement is operating under these parameters. So what Öcalan and the freedom movement did is to, you know, like come out of that crack, what that was created in Syria, with a third way that it called democratic confederalism and democratic autonomy. Now, what the US did, like playing chess, is what the US is trying to do is make Rojava dependent on itself, you know, by, you know, telling Rojava, look, if I tell Turkey, they'll attack you, you know. Russia is doing the same thing. I mean, this is what happened to Afrin, you know. So there are all these, of course, balances of power and daily intrigues and games that go on, you know. So therefore, on the one hand, there is concessions with the US, you know. On the other hand, there is this extreme pressure on the people, you know, because so that, I mean, there were so many times that under these attacks that people were actually forced to leave, you know, and they did this mostly internally, but, you know, there was the desire to push people out of the area and break the revolution in this way as well. So therefore, you know, so therefore there are lots of things going on at the same time. But the hope is here that despite all of this, there are huge number of people who are not leaving their land. And they want to develop themselves in accordance with the theory that I've been talking about. because we are maybe outside of there, but they live it day in and day out. How a backward Kurdish men can actually collaborate with ISIS in Afrin or elsewhere. They are living this day in and day out. So they are seeing the value of this theory. Oh, the practice is a little bit more difficult maybe, because as I said, there's a huge war going on. And as much as they want to develop the economy, it's still pretty much a war economy. This is why the oil fields are working, you know. Otherwise, under all this pressure, although they don't want to work it, you know, because of ecological reasons, because of the fact that who do you sell the petrol to? You sell it back to the same people that are oppressing you,
yeah.
You know. So there are all these layers of complications on the ground. But the people and their guides are adamant in trying to rescue themselves or liberate themselves from this patriarchal mindset, you know, because they've seen what the other end of life is like. Okay, I'm going to, I think I answered a little bit about women's freedom issue as well, you know. As a result, I think, you know, women both during the time of the Syrian regime, and as well as during the time of ISIS, as well as during the times of patriarchal movements of Kurds, saw the difference. And I think, especially with Öcalan, but also in general, the Kurdish freedom movement, what it does is it doesn't create opponents within the system. You know, it creates mechanisms to invigorate the society, but what it does, it also tries to convince the patriarchal male that this is also no good for him, you know. So there are also very much education towards the men as well to this end, because at the end of the day, society as a whole, you're going to have to live together, you know. So we can't, you know, disintegrate it. But so what is done is to convince everybody on every point, on each point, when possible. If not possible, the woman can say, and she has the voting power to say, no, this is it, this is how it goes. So I think that's also important. Deep democracy as a form of self-defense, definitely. I mean, what was really fighting, or is still yet, what is the struggle is between freedom-loving forces in the Middle East and those that want to dominate, want to establish hegemony. If the Kurds fought against ISIS, it wasn't because of the weapons they had, or even at the end when the US came to bomb, the alliance forces came to bomb. That was right at the end. But they resisted, and they were resilient to the end, that Kobani as a whole was destroyed. And the reason that they resisted isn't just because, oh yeah, Kurdistan, but they truly believed in their total, you know, freedom of women, freedom of themselves as individuals. So I think that the essence of that is just so at the core of what the Kurds are doing and how they are resisting and how they can be resilient. You know, they also have still the past memory. So yeah, self-defense is definitely then, you know, is not just the military aspect. It is at the core of all of this. All of this is self-defense, you know, like developing their own health is a self-defense, And they're doing this actually, you know. I mean, you know, there are some extreme maybe conditions that can't be treated there, but you know, the whole society knows how to deal with normal conditions that can be fixed, you know. And this can be expanded and extended to different fields of life.
I was quite concerned about the survival of the council system, of the institutions that have been put in place to protect and preserve this civil form of democracy in Rojava. But in my conversations with people there, in fact, what happened was a kind of a consolidation and a kind of an increase of resistance and in other words, the structures and the passion around promoting the revolution and defending it have not been affected. They haven't, in fact, withdrawn or retreated. They have withstood the pressures that you're describing. And that was immensely hopeful for me because I was quite worried that the Turkish invasion and the withdrawal of the American troops at that point, you know, when Trump said, okay, we're going to withdraw, you come in and occupy this so-called demilitarized zone, but that in fact that the institutions of the revolution have withstood the pressure in the invasion and continue to evolve and develop, you know, as their vision has been impelling them to do. So I think that's hopeful.
Sure.
I would like to.
Yeah. Sorry. Can I just add something? I think that there's a feeling that this is a top-down thing. I mean, there is a guidance, obviously, because these ideas, of course, are developed through a group of people, a movement over time, as they have struggled, you know. But of course, you know, we are seeing how much internalized these are, even though if, for example, if you go and talk to a person on the street, even if they cannot theoretically describe it in such a way, but they are totally internalized. And this is the reason for the resilience and the resistance. So this continues and goes on. And not only for the Kurdish people, for the Arabs in the region, for the Assyrians in the region, for different beliefs in the region, you know, like the Yazidi Kurds. I mean, this is also so very important. And all the self-defense points we've been talking about, not only in terms of military self-defense, but in all other areas are also true for these communities. Because, you know, this is the best self-defense of any community. If they can stay as a society in all these different spheres of life and living, this is the way towards a freedom. And this is why they also have their council systems in place in this way.
We have collected 3 questions. John, maybe can you see?
Yes, I can see. I'm just looking at them now.
Yeah.
Let me just read them, okay? And I think if we can contain the conversation of these 3 questions, perhaps to begin with, we'll be doing well. So the first question from the Chinese audience, coming from a Marxist background, what areas of Marxism does Öcalan consider still valid? Class theory, labor theory of value, base and superstructure? So that's the first question. Second, how well do you think Öcalan and the Rojava experience are received globally, particularly among the left and the general masses? And the third question, do you see any difference with the Zapad? Sorry?
I didn't understand the second question, sorry.
Okay, let me repeat it for you. How well do you think Öcalan and the Rojava experience are received by were received globally, particularly among the left and the general masses. Okay? And then finally, do you see any difference with the Zapatista theory in Mexico, in Chiapas, which has a very similar political philosophy and praxis in Chiapas? So, 3 interesting questions.
Yes, very interesting. Yeah, I mean,
can I suggest something?
Okay.
Havin, why don't we? I wouldn't mind if you answered the 3rd question first. Any difference between the Rojava experience and the Zapatistas in Mexico? I think that'd be an interesting to consider.
Okay. Yeah, I think with the Zapatistas, obviously, the similarity, I think, arises from the fact that Öcalan does not disregard the very beginnings of humanity and how, you know, human beings actually organized and what they did. And so he also did listen and does listen to the people and the way that they have been organizing themselves, you know. So most often than not, for example, people say, you know, that most of all this councils and all these stuff, that Öcalan has really been influenced by Bookchin and taken from there. To a certain extent, of course, Öcalan has been influenced by Bookchin's theory, but he is also going back into time and trying to understand the way that the societies or communities actually you know, organize themselves, and this is why he's going so much more in depth into the women's you know, age of organization. This is why he's so much interested in the enslavement of women, because he's wondering, if it is not for biological reasons, and he knows it's not, what was it for? You know, why was the woman overthrown? And this is what he calls counter-revolution against the woman. Why was she wrapped under so many theories of oppression, exploitation, and whatever? You know, what is being hidden there? So therefore, he comes up with the elements or the parameters of, you know, care, solidarity, what's being demeaned and lowered, and what's really of value, what is not, you know, and I guess, I guess, you know, this is the reason, maybe why, you know, the situation arises with Marxism and Leninism, for example, you know. That he's critical of a lot of the things, but of course, although he's critical, he's not totally disregarding. You know, I am not the best expert on Marxism, but what I can say is that I think Öcalan expands what Marx is saying, you know, by saying that actually the role that the worker plays is woman, you know. So he even defines it as such. He says woman is the first class, you know, it's the first colony, it's the first nation, in the sense of this exploitation and oppression. So therefore, you know, he is, I think he is critical of a lot of things, but he is expanding on the points that he's critical of. So he's not like some people would like to put it, like totally turning against Marx or whatever. Or of course of Lenin as well. He's very much critical of this party model, you know, which he says that repeats it once they are in power as a state. So so therefore, you know, even of anarchists, that they say, okay, this is the evil, but we will use the evil, maybe to a certain degree, you know. So he is kind of critical in these senses, but as I said, also expanding on them. And he sees this work, of course, as monumental at the same time. But I think especially the value of women's labor is quite highly critical, and also of Engels, that seeing this linear development of society, that, you know, like capitalism is at the end somehow more progressive than the rest, you know. So, but I guess you will all have to read Öcalan to see exactly where he diverges from all that. Now, I think the more people learn
let me ask
about,
whether...
let me go into this question as well, and maybe, and I think the more the people know about Öcalan, the more their perception of him becomes positive. Because imagine a situation, and I go into that in my book actually, that, you know, this PKK gets established in the terrible ambience of Cold War in the Middle East, where Kurdistan is sealed and partitioned and, you know, torn into 4 parts, and nobody wants to hear about the Kurds. And suddenly Kurdistan Workers' Party comes up with a socialist theory to say, I will make it one, and as a socialist Kurdistan in a Middle Eastern confederation. Now, you know, this is a Molotov cocktail. Nobody wanted it, including the Soviet Union. Nobody wanted it. And as a result, and with the 1980 coup, the Turkish left, which was before 1980, was more progressive in their attitude to the Kurds, but after the coup became very chauvinistic, you know, very, you know, like Turkish nationalist, you know, in saying, and I think this is experienced in Roshilat, in Kurdistan, in Iran as well, that, you know, if you say, what about Kurds and Kurdistan, the left in Iran, in Turkey, brand you as nationalist, that you are a tool of the imperialists, you know. So therefore, under this ambience, the PKK was automatically transmitted around the world as something very negative, you know. But I think as much as we are able to translate Öcalan, and of course with the revolution in Rojava, people seeing the practice of this are wondering who Öcalan is, and their view of Öcalan is automatically something else, you know. Yeah, I can, it's very positive. This is what I'm saying. The reaction is absolutely very positive.
Yes, so you just touched on a second question that was given to us around how the revolution in Rojava has actually been received and experienced by large portions of the left and internationally. Fouâd, I wonder if you would like to add any reflections or comments to these questions or the discussion so far. I don't want to leave you out of this conversation.
Sure thing. I think these are all basically 3 great questions, and I think Havin touched on the important stuff. Vis-a-vis the first question, I think the main thing to note about Öcalan's Marxist take is that Öcalan belongs to that kind of subaltern group of Marxist theorists. That is, they consider that role of capital to be so central to their articulation of the system. That is, capital is a form of stratifying economic power and dispossessing agents of production of power, such as women, such as workers. However, he departs is from this linear progression of history, and also from this totally working class subject of history type of reading of Marx. So he's more of inclusive, more pluralist. So that is kind of the main differentiation point. So he fits more within the kind of subalternist readings of capital. Vis-a-vis the third question, the differences, I think the main thing about Zapatista theory, and this isn't, I think, is to note that, as Havin pointed out, is the strategic gist of Öcalan's approach, of how he basically, why he comes up with these ideas, which isn't to say that Zapatista theory isn't strategic their source of inspiration. It's a different strategic coordinates that we're talking about because they're contending with one state, whereas the Kurds are contending with 4 states and all these imperialist actors that are intervening and all that stuff. So this entire framework of coming up with this theories of democratic nation and democratic confederalism are basically ways of making sure that they pacify some of these aggressing forces in the Middle East while kind of developing the democratic capacities of Kurdish movements. So that is kind of the main area that is the main area of kind of divergence between Zapatista theory and Kurdish theory, and it's that Kurdish theory has to account for more kind of strategic antagonists, and that brings out a particular aspect of Öcalan's work, which I think is absolutely brilliant and novel. Vis-a-vis the second question, and this is something I have firsthand experience with, I think it's important to distinguish the global left and how they received the Rojava revolution. I think based on what Havin said, that's absolutely true. There was this other development that came out of Öcalan's thinking was that PKK, because it was always branded as this kind of force that's working against these so-called post-colonial states in the Middle East, they were always considered to be a negative force in the region, whereas they were fighting for an equally colonized people who were then basically removed from global spotlight. So not only this put us back in spotlight and actually shown basically Kurdish aspirations to not only be legitimate post-colonial aspirations or anti-colonial aspirations, but for them to be also legitimate leftist and pluralist and democratic aspirations. But I think it also kind of created this very important split within the left, which didn't exist before, which we can kind of divide into these groups that I would call kind of the new Stalinists, who continue, for example, some of them even were siding with ISIS because they thought ISIS is an anti-American force, that type of group, which didn't take to Rojava very well. And then this kind of majority of the left, the more kind of progressive left, that was very receptive towards Rojava. They were our allies. They were there for basically solidarity. So I think it's important to realize that a lot of work was done to kind of split the field and then to have the real allies, the progressive allies on our side. So I think that's something I would like to add to Havin's discussion.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm still curious whether there have been any other, questions that have been posed to us that we might share? I guess not.
Maybe very shortly, by the time we understand whether there are any questions or not, I could go into Öcalan's conditions a little bit, and I think that would be in order. Yeah. Because ever since his abduction, we talked a little bit about his development and evolution of his ideas, not only before 99 but after 99. He's now held on an island prison. It's called the Imralı Island prison. It's 25 kilometers squared. It's an island of 25 kilometers squared, and it's in the Marmara Sea. Now, it was turned into a sole person closed prison just before Öcalan actually arrived there. It used to be an open prison. It's actually the prison that is in the Midnight Express, if you've ever watched that movie. And there's also been a prime minister who was executed on that island. So it's a very famous island, and it used to be a Greek island, of course. And I forgot the Greek name at the moment of that island. But it was shut down and it was rebuilt according to the needs of bringing Öcalan there. It is guarded by 1,000 soldiers. It has been declared a military zone. He was more than 10 years the only prisoner on the island. Later, after 10 years, which is about 2011, I think, Other prisoners were brought in there, and now there are 3 others apart from him. And all of them are Kurdish. So it's basically a prison for Kurds. And they're all from the PKK. And they've all been given the aggravated life sentence. And this is why I say, the system of the nation states do not care what's happening to not just the Kurds, but people who are colonized and oppressed, because he's been given the aggravated life sentence and the other 3 as well. This means, that they will never have the parole. Aggravated life sentence was a sentence specifically made up for Öcalan. And now it's being used for a lot of different people. And we don't know how much they actually see one another in that island. I think it's like maybe 6 hours per week. And there are usually disciplinary penalties so that they don't see each other. Even those couple of hours are, are prevented. Now, it might be good for context that there was a talks for talks with Öcalan and the PKK that started in 2013 that looked pretty serious. And, there was a couple of tries before that. And this is where the revolution of Rojava kind of came out of, because Öcalan was able to converse with family and others. And but these talks actually collapsed in 2015, because what the Turkish state demanded was that PKK lay down arms before they make any agreement. And Öcalan didn't accept this. And he said, it's for PKK to accept or reject. I can't do something like this out of prison. And since then, and ever since actually 2011, lawyers aren't able to see him. I think they only saw him twice since 2011. And since in 2019, once his brother saw him, and once on April 27th, his one and only telephone conversation in the presence of a prosecutor took place. So basically, we don't know what's happening on that island. And the reason why I'm saying this is for all of you to understand what kind of a situation the Kurds are subjected to in the personage of Öcalan. When there are talks with Öcalan, there is a humongous development in terms of trying to bring peace and resolve the question, not only for the Kurds, like in Turkey, it was celebration for Armenians, Assyrians, the Pontus, everybody was able to go back to their villages and etc. But when we are seeing that there is no contact as such with Öcalan, there is a huge unleashment of violence against the Kurds as well, So therefore, this is so interconnected, Necessarily, an achievement of Kurdish struggle brings about change in circumstances of Öcalan, or the other way around. If there's talks with Öcalan, it brings immense extension of areas of freedom for the Kurdish people. Öcalan was an amazing supporter, and he was very adamant that the Kurds go and save the Yazidi Kurds in Shengal. He was very angry that that people sat around and did nothing. So he was the motor power actually behind what happened in Rojava and also in Shengal. So they realized this, but at the same time, of course, his jailers also realized that the Kurds are resilient and they have internalized, and they are the actual actors in the struggle for freedom. And this is why
Correct.
Öcalan is saying that he sees capitalism as the age of hope. I think it's so fitting for this seminar. He says capitalism is the age of hope because we know so much about ourselves now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, maybe I read out some questions in the chat room. There are two questions. One, could Havin elaborate the meaning of commune as the base of the democratic society? Do they practice collective ownership of land? And two, how the communes in Rojava deal with the COVID-19?
Yes, I mean, first with maybe COVID-19. You know, obviously, despite the fact that the Syrian regime and the Turkish regime's approach to Rojava in many different areas, and Turkish regime's attacks and assaults on Rojava and occupation is clear, what they still do is these international organizations are giving the aid and also things related to COVID-19 over these states, you know, which is, you know, impossible. It's amazing that it can be done. Therefore, they are all, of course, on their own in the fight against this. But of course, the more left-wing forces, doctors, organizations, movements have been very, very helpful in every way that they can in terms of, you know, their opportunities in the fight against that. So there's been quite a few, you know, people losing their lives, of course, but the community, the people have been very careful and also trying to adhere to the announcements or the, you know, the advisors of the councils, the different councils throughout Rojava. So it's pretty difficult in that sense over there. In terms of course, the communes, I guess the communes, you know, should not be just looked at only in terms of the land. Of course, although one of the very first who left Rojava were the very rich, you know, and who wanted to take all their belongings and themselves out of the country. And of course, there were both the state land and also, which there's quite a bit of, state owns a lot of land in Rojava, and also the land of the more of the elite has been, of course, collectivized. But the principle of convincing applies even to this area, that instead of just going and taking, you know, there has been those landowners who have been convinced. And actually in 2018, when I was there, by just chance, I came across one, you know, that, you know, because we were traveling as a group in a bus and we stopped somewhere and we began talking, and he said, you know, I don't know, I was convinced, I don't know how, but I don't owe as much as I used to anymore. So, and this is not a, you know, convincing based on threats, because, you know, I mean, Stalinism is critiqued exactly because of this. You can't just impose things top down and try to change the chemistry of the society, of the people, by just top down things. And so in trying to keep together the harmony, they are of course trying to also convince these landowners as much as possible. And this is possible because the ill-intended ones are already gone, and the ones who are in there is working closely to try to make it work. But of course, it's far from over. You know, don't let me make it sound as if everything is now collective and communal. But the commune does far more than that. The commune actually decides on a lot of different areas of life, which also includes, of course, you know, economic production, but other things in terms of, you know, social disruption, or if there are problems between neighbors, or, you know, in terms of violence against women, or in terms of lots of different, you know, if, for example, you're going to make the road in the village, you know, to make decisions on that together, or in the city or whatever. So all things that are related to day in and day out of living in that particular area. Yeah.
Havin, I have a question for you. I've got 3 more questions that have come up in a chat, which I'll get to in a moment. But this is an important point. One of the real attractions, I think, of the ideology, if we can put it that way, of democratic confederalism is its pluralism. And it did not, like conventional sort of Marxist theory, completely reject the idea of, you know, private enterprise, for example, or small-scale family firms and family enterprise. Has the institution of private property, however, been retained? Because there's been a large amount of collective development of state land, but I don't believe that has meant the extinction or the delegitimation of private property per se. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's very difficult as things stand at the moment. If I may just give an example, for example, with trade with South Kurdistan. The KDP at the border gate is not allowing for anyone to go across and do the trade, but it's picking and choosing. So in fact, what it's trying to do is make sure that, you know, there's some kind of a leg of what you're talking about still present in Rojava. So therefore, you know, it's not, as you say, a complete, you know, stamping out of it. And I guess the principle here is that private property has to serve the common wealth of the society and of the people, you know. So actually what they are really opposing is monopolization of anything, you know, whether it's an area of production, or whether it's knowledge of education, or you know, or private enterprise as such. So the monopoly of profits or accumulation is not accepted. But if it's benefiting in some way the society, you know, it's not just outright rejected because it's private property, you know, in that sense. So and if I was able to go in, I would have really tried to show how state itself is a culmination of monopolies, you know, in different areas of our life, you know. So this is the movement, therefore, is very much against this monopolization.
Okay, I'm going to switch now, if you don't mind, to the 3 questions. And I think this is going to have to be our last set of 3 questions before we break, right? I think we're running to the end of our time. These are more questions from the Chinese audience. 1, apart from Öcalan, that was mentioned in the speaker's speech, are there other important thinkers for the cause of Rojava? 2, are there major differences within the Rojava movement on visions for the future or strategies? And 3, how can the PKK get rid of the image of terrorism as portrayed by the Turkish state? Let me ask Fouâd, would you be interested in responding to either of those 3 questions?
Yes, I could do that. If having his comments, I can add to our comments.
Okay.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Right.
If I feel that I need to add something, I will.
Okay. I think the main thing, vis-a-vis the thinkers that are currently, there are many people who are in fact writing about this, Havin herself, and there are many feminist thinkers within the genealogy movement. So the journal, there are a lot of really great feminist scholars that are working on that. Vis-a-vis, not within Rojava itself, but if you want to kind of look at the progression of this thing, maybe Sarah Sakina Johnson's diaries that were been recently translated and published in many languages. She was one of the co-founders of the PKK, assassinated by Turkey, so that's something to look into. But I want to get into the second question: are there major differences within the Rojava movement? I think this is something that I could speak more about. There are differences. I think there is a bit of a schism, if not necessarily within Rojava, within the wider northern, basically Kurdistan movement, the PKK especially itself. I think there are factions right now that think that the alliance with the Americans has kind of exhausted its strategic potential and it's time to reclaim autonomy from the American aspirations in the Middle East. And I think there are those who are more within the SDF command, who are more the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the official kind of the umbrella military organization Rojava, that are more prone to staying the course with the U.S. strategy. So there are schisms, and there's a lot of debate and a lot of kind of articles and dialogue, and heated debate and all that stuff between these factions. So yeah, so there's an important thing that we could talk about more, but I just want to acknowledge that it's there. And I think the third point, again, Havin could probably speak better on than that. There are a lot of things that are being done right now. All these, for example, we recently won, that is the Kurdish movement, recently won this important legal battle in Belgium to basically delist PKK as a terrorist organization according to European Union laws. So there are these things that are being done in addition to all the kind of the peoples, the marches, all this other stuff that's being done. So yeah, that's these are my takes on the questions.
Okay. Havin, would you like to respond to any of those or add any further commentary?
I think, maybe to the terrorism issue. I tried to actually talk about it a little bit during the discussion as well. It's not just the Turkish state, of course. It is spearheaded by the Turkish state. And the global powers are also very much behind this. We know Germany, for example, is an adamant supporter of not only Turkish state policies towards different peoples, like Armenians, for example. Germany was also supporting the up and coming Turkish state in its genocide of the Armenians, and also is still the case to date by the German state. This is the case with England and the US, of course. I mean, US again propelled these discussions when they put the 3 founding members, well, 2 founding members and another member of the PKK on the list of, offering rewards for them. So therefore, this is propelling Turkey, encouraging Turkey to actually accelerate what it is doing. Because what we saw was that during the talks for talks, before 2015, at different stages, despite all our efforts, we couldn't get neither the European Union or any other power to get involved in these, or to encourage actually these talks for a political and peaceful solution. So therefore, You know, before it was separatism or communism. After the Cold War, it became more like terrorism. And in fact, all the national liberation movements or any such grassroots organizations came to be listed under terrorism by the states that wage a war on them. You know, the war that the Turkish state wages on the Kurds is itself terrorism. What the PKK and the Kurds are doing is actually mostly self-defense than anything else. And despite all their technical capabilities and NATO's full support behind this terrorism tag, we are seeing that they are not successful. And the reason is because of the people's own desire to live in a different way than has been tailored for them by these different global and regional powers. You know, that include Russia and even so China at the same time. So therefore, how do we get rid of it? Well, I think, you know, just like Nelson Mandela in South Africa, in a similar vein, we can talk about it, you know, although he became the prime president, he was still on the terror list, and so was the ANC. So therefore, these are all political categorization, you know. When the political situation changes, we will definitely see that this kind of categorization will also change. So I don't think we should be hang up on this. And I think this is also, of course, to curb the international support that will pour for the Kurds, you know, because if something is categorized as terrorist, the average person on the street should not be supporting it. You know, the message is pretty clear. So I think the way to encounter it is to make it void by supporting this kind of movement.
Well, on that note, I guess I will just in my sort of closing thoughts on this subject, you know, sort of the case of hope in catastrophic times. I can't think of a better and more hopeful example than what is happening in Rojava. In the context of a bloody 10-year-long Syrian catastrophic war, invasion on all sides by hostile powers, internal dissension and contention around what is the meaning of Kurdish identity, what's our political future. You still have the emergence of what I would say is kind of a vanguard idealism for systemic and democratic evolution globally in Rojava. And if that is possible in Rojava, it always gives me the hope that it's possible anywhere. The other point that I would raise, which I think is very important, is that as in Chiapas in Mexico and as in other movements in the global south among peasant organizations, among indigenous peoples, that the case of democratic confederalism in Rojava is providing leadership to activists, political philosophers, system change makers in the West and in the North. And it's coming not from the bastions of liberal democracy in Europe, but from, you know, the hinterland and backwaters of a forgotten corner of Syria. That these principles of democracy, of freedom, of the maturation and evolution of civil society is taking place in a corner of the world that nobody could have expected of it, which to me has a very universal message to it, a message which has deep roots that go back to the very beginnings of democratic political philosophy in Europe, but also has, in a sense, cultivated and revivified the roots of traditional forms of elder and tribal democracy within the Kurdish community itself in Syria and in the surrounding regions. So there's a profound, I think, universal message in what is taking place in Rojava. And it has a signal that goes all the way back to the very beginnings of democratic theory in the West, and providing a completely different image of modern, or rather postmodern philosophy for a modernity that is not capitalist, that is not statist, but it is civil and democratic. And it's an experiment and a pilot, in a sense, of what might be possible in the future. So I just think it's extraordinarily inspirational and powerful.
Definitely.
And that the fact that it's still surviving and thriving is a miracle in itself.
And I think at this point, I would really like to mention David Graeber, who was a professor of anthropology. He was a public intellectual, and he unfortunately passed away on 2nd of September 2020. And he was an amazing advocate of the revolution in Rojava. He was one of the first actually to understand or want to understand what was going on in there. As I said, it was clustered so much with Arab nationalism, the so-called imperialism coming within the region, but their own colonization efforts inside, that it couldn't really break out of Middle East and let everybody understand what was going on. So David Graeber was actually one of the very few first persons who detected what was going on there and who defended it very strongly. So as we come up to his first year of losing his life, I really would like to commemorate him. We lost a very important person, just the whole world, because, you know, he was an amazing mind. It was a huge loss, I have to say. So he could also see the hope in times of capitalism, in the, you know, symbolically in Rojava, that all wasn't lost.
True. And do you have any final comments you'd like to add, Fouâd?
No, I haven't. Thank you, everyone, for the great panel.
Yeah. And Havin, you mentioned David Graeber, and actually in China, in some Chinese newspaper, they already translate his articles about Rojava and also even Wallstan comments on Rojava.
That's right.
So
That's right.
so our Chinese reader actually is quite familiar with the experience of Rojava, and also the readership of each article was around 500 million. Yeah, so it's really amazing. And we would like to continue our discussion and debate about the community regeneration in different areas, because in China, we also have the rural reconstruction movement, and it lasts for the at least 20 years. But if you contextualize this movement, actually, our ancestors actually start at the beginning of the 20th century because of modernization project, and then we have the consequence of rural destruction. That means we name our movement as the rural regeneration, reconstruction. So for not only China, but also India. They also in Kerala, there is also the concept of rural-urban republics. So we emphasize the village-based, community-based movement. So now we have this movement. Actually, we create try to promote kind of the ecological dimension, but at the same time we try to do some experience of the finalization. So we have two ways. One, we have to empower our young generation, have a ecological mind, and at the same time, we have to fight against the financial capitalism. So this is very important for our movement. So now we encourage to do some kind of comparative studies between different community experience in Kerala, in Rojava, in Zapatista, and also in MST. So we try to make this kind of link and try to learn from each other and exchange some experience. So and enrich also our movement to do criticism and at the same time do self-criticism. So thank you very much for tonight, a very wonderful discussion and debate on Rojava experience.